Okay, chapters 11 and 12 of Daniel, of course, are intertwined with chapter 10, that we looked at last week. So just kind of a couple of quick um, comments on that transition. So chapter 10 introduces this final vision, and this vision is considered to be kind of the grand finale of the book of Daniel. It covers a lot more territory in terms of history, and kind of brings everything to its final resolution for the writer of the book of Daniel. Um, just a reminder, I really liked this statement that I found as I was reading a couple weeks ago about prophecy. So we've been saying that prophecy is not about what is going to happen. Prophecy is about why is this happening. And so in apocalypse, and so prophecy and apocalypse, according to this author that I was reading, is a judgment of history. So it isn't looking forward and saying what is going to happen in history. It's looking backward and saying, why has this happened? Why is this happening in the way that it is happening? And making some kind of pronouncement about the theological meaning and the theological um, um, value, I guess, of the events. So themes that we have been looking at for many weeks now, and will continue to see here in chapters 11 and 12. How long is this going to take? Where are we in history, and when is this going to be over? What will be the outcome of these events? All these things are swirling around us and happening around us, and all these terrible events are occurring, and we're seeing them. What is the outcome? What's the end going to look like? But again, I think that those are the natural questions to ask. But in terms of being faithful to God, they are not the correct questions to be asking. I think the theme of chapters 10 through 12, and really the theme of the entire book of Daniel, is that God's will be done. So no matter what kind of chaos and persecution and uncertainty God's people experience, God is in control of everything that's happening. God's will be done. If we are still in the middle of the suffering, if we are still confused, if we are still worried, then that means that the story has not ended yet. And we don't know when the story will end, but we do know how the story will end, at least in terms of the final chapter, which will be God's will being done. So in chapters 11 and 12, we are going to see the writer is going to be placing, basically for them, all of history into this theological framework. So we started with the Babylonian captivity in 605 or 587 BCE, where the people of God are trampled over by the Babylonians. Their temple is destroyed. Everything that they ever knew is taken away from them. They are taken into exile in Babylon. And we see from the very beginning that God is in control of that situation, even though historically people didn't understand or think that a God could exist and be active outside of its own boundaries. We see that this God is different. This God is capable of not only acting in Babylon on behalf of the people of God, but actually acting on people who are not God's people, on the Babylonian captors. And so from the very beginning, what we're seeing is a placement of historical events into this theological framework of God's will is going to be done. And so then we get into some of these later chapters, in chapter 7 and 8 and 9, where we see all these weird visions. And what is that about? It's actually about the same exact thing. It's about placing history within this theological framework about God. Let's look at the events that have occurred and figure out what it means. Give it that theological judgment. Say, this is how God feels about this, and this is how you should feel about it too. So moving into chapter 11, we're actually going to expand out a little bit more from some of those historical, from some of those theological judgments of history, and the chapter 11 is going to even bring in some additional history, additional stories from the period between Daniel, person in Babylon, during the the mid to maybe late, depending on how long he would have lived, 500s BCE, all the way up through the time of Antiochus IV. So any questions about anything that we've been talking about, the themes generally, chapter 10, anything that you've been chewing over since last week? Good. All right, well today since this is probably our last session together, it's a very long reading, but I would love for this reading to be read all as one reading. And I didn't want to ask any of you specifically to do that because that's a lot of reading. So I will read it unless there is somebody who would love to read all of chapters 11 and 12 all in one go. And if nobody says it, then I will be happy to do it. Getting lots of nods. Okay. So I'm going to read from the New Revised Standard Version, which is my version of choice these days, but certainly feel free to follow along in whatever version you've got. And I'd love to hear some of the differences in your versions that maybe change the meaning a little bit for us. So starting with Daniel chapter 11. As for me, in the first year of Darius the Mede, I stood up to support and strengthen him. Now I will announce the truth to you. 3 more kings shall arise in Persia. The 4th shall be far richer than all of them. And when he has been strong through his riches, he shall stir up all against the kingdom of Greece. Then a warrior king shall arise, who shall rule with great dominion and take action as he pleases. And while still rising in power, his kingdom shall be broken and divided toward the 4 winds of heaven, but not to his posterity, nor according to the dominion with which he ruled. For his kingdom shall be uprooted and go to others besides these. Then the king of the south shall grow strong, but one of his officers shall grow stronger than he, and shall rule a realm greater than his own realm. After some years they shall make an alliance, and the daughter of the king of the south shall come to the king of the north to ratify the agreement. But she shall not retain her power, and her offspring shall not endure. She shall be given up, she and her attendants and her child and the one who supported her. In those times a branch from her root shall rise up in his place. He shall come against the army and enter the fortress of the king of the north, and he shall take action against them and prevail. Even their gods with their idols and with their precious vessels of silver and gold he shall carry off to Egypt as spoils of war. For some years he shall refrain from attacking the king of the north. Then the latter shall invade the realm of the king of the south, but will return to his own land. His son shall wage war and assemble a multitude of great forces, which shall advance like a flood, and pass through, and again shall carry the war as far as his fortress. Moved with rage, the king of the south shall go out and do battle against the king of the north, who shall muster a great multitude, which shall, however, be defeated by his enemy. When the multitude has been carried off, his heart shall be exalted, and he shall overthrow tens of thousands, but he shall not prevail. For the king of the north shall again raise a multitude, larger than the former, and after some years he shall advance with a great army and abundant supplies. In those times many shall rise against the king of the south. The lawless among your own people shall lift themselves up in order to fulfill the vision, but they shall fall. Then the king of the north shall come and throw up siege works and take a well-fortified city. And the forces of the south shall not stand, not even his picked troops, for there shall be no strength to resist. But he who comes against him shall take the actions he pleases, and no one shall withstand him. He shall take a position in the beautiful land, and all of it shall be in his power.
Need the same number, but from.
He shall set his mind to come with the strength of his whole kingdom, and he shall bring terms of peace and perform them. In order to destroy the kingdom, he shall give him a woman in marriage, but it shall not succeed or be to his advantage. Afterward, he shall turn to the coastlands and shall capture many. But a commander shall put an end to his insolence. Indeed, he shall turn his insolence back upon him. Then he shall turn back toward the fortresses of his own land, but he shall stumble and fall, and shall not be found. Then shall arise in his place one who shall send an official for the glory of the kingdom. But within a few days he shall be broken, though not in anger or in battle. In his place shall arise a contemptible person on whom royal majesty had not been conferred. He shall come in without warning and obtain the kingdom through intrigue. Armies shall be utterly swept away and broken before him, and the prince of the covenant as well. And after an alliance is made with him, he shall act deceitfully and become strong with a small party. Without warning, he shall come into the richest parts of the province and do what none of his predecessors had ever done, lavishing plunder, spoil, and wealth on them. He shall devise plans against strongholds, but only for a time. He shall stir up his power and determination against the king of the south with a great army, and the king of the south shall wage war with a much greater and stronger army. But he shall not succeed, for plots shall be devised against him by those who eat of the royal rations. They shall break him, his army shall be swept away, and many shall fall slain. The two kings, their minds bent on evil, shall sit at one table and exchange lies. But it shall not succeed, for there remains an end at the time appointed. He shall return to his land with great wealth, but his heart shall be set against the holy covenant. He shall work his will and return to his own land. At that time appointed that he shall return and come into the south, but this time it shall not be as it was before. For ships of Kittim shall come against him, and he shall lose heart and withdraw. He shall be enraged and take action against the holy covenant. He shall turn back and pay heed to those who forsake the holy covenant. Forces sent by him shall occupy and profane the temple and fortress. They shall abolish the regular burnt offering and set up the abomination that makes desolate. He shall seduce with intrigue those who violate the covenant, but the people who are loyal to their God shall stand firm and take action. The wise among the people shall give understanding to many. For some days, however, they shall fall by sword and flame and suffer captivity and plunder. When they fall victim, they shall receive a little help, and many shall join them insincerely. Some of the wise shall fall, so that they may be refined, purified, and cleansed, until the time of the end, for there is still an interval until the time appointed. The king shall act as he pleases. He shall exalt himself and consider himself greater than any god, and shall speak horrendous things against the God of gods. He shall prosper until the period of wrath is completed, for what is determined shall be done. He shall pay no respect to the gods of his ancestors or to the one beloved by women. He shall pay no respect to any other god, for he shall consider himself greater than all. He shall honor the God of fortresses instead of these. A God whom his ancestors did not know he shall honor with gold and silver, with precious stones and costly gifts. He shall deal with the strongest fortresses by the help of a foreign god. Those who acknowledge him he shall make more wealthy, and shall appoint them as rulers over many, and shall distribute the land for a price. At the time of the end, the king of the south shall attack him, but the king of the north shall rush upon him like a whirlwind, with chariots and horsemen, and with many ships. He shall advance against countries and pass through like a flood. He shall come into the beautiful land, and tens of thousands shall fall victim. But Edom and Moab and the main parts of the Ammonites shall escape from his power. He shall stretch out his hand against the countries, and the land of Egypt shall not escape. He shall become ruler of the treasures of gold and of silver, and all the riches of Egypt, and the Libyans and the Ethiopians shall follow in his train. But reports from the east and the north shall alarm him, and he shall go out with great fury to bring ruin and complete destruction to many. He shall pitch his palatial tents between the sea and the beautiful holy mountain. Yet he shall come to his end, with no one to help him. At that time, the great prince, Michael, the protector of your people, shall arise. There shall be a time of anguish, such as never occurred since nations first came into existence. But at that time your people shall be delivered, everyone who is found written in the book. Many of those who sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake, some to everlasting life, and some to shame and everlasting contempt. Those who are wise shall shine like the brightness of the sky, and those who lead many to righteousness like the stars forever and ever. But you, Daniel, keep the word secret and the book sealed until the time of the end. Many shall be running back and forth, and evil shall increase. Then I, Daniel, looked, and two others appeared, one standing on this bank of the stream and one on the other. One of them said to the man clothed in linen who was upstream, "How long shall it be until the end of these wonders?" The man clothed in linen who was upstream raised his right hand and his left hand toward heaven. And I heard him swear by the one who lives forever that it would be for a time, 2 times, and half a time, and that when the shattering of the power of the holy people comes to an end, all these things would be accomplished. I heard but could not understand. So I said, "My Lord, what shall be the outcome of these things?" He said, "Go your way, Daniel, for the words are to remain secret and sealed until the time of the end. Many shall be purified, cleansed, and refined, but the wicked shall continue to act wickedly. None of the wicked shall understand, but those who are wise shall understand. From the time the regular burnt offering is taken away and the abomination that desolates is set up, there shall be 1,290 days. Happy are those who persevere and attain the 1,335 days. But go your way and rest. You shall rise for your reward at the end of the days." Here ends the reading and the book.
That was easy to follow, Katie.
Yeah, no problem.
Why do you prefer the New Revised Standard Version over others?
The Revised Standard Version, which this is based on, was edited in the late 70s and early 80s, and it was done by committees of people, and so they worked together to do the translation from the original Hebrew using a little bit of the guidance from the Revised Standard Version, and I prefer that to the NIV is very popular among a lot of people too. But the NIV I find to be very inconsistent in the value of its translations because it was translated by individual people. So if we were the committee of people that were going to translate and we were the NIV committee, I would take Ezekiel and Karen would take Matthew, and each of us would do our own translations, and then they would bring them together and put them into the Bible. And so some people who were really, really strong scholars of that language and of that book of the Bible did a fantastic job. But other ones are not quite as strong in terms of their translations. And so I prefer the NRSV just because that was, the entire thing was done by the committee. So instead of each of us divvying out, we would all sit together and say, all right, today we're going to do Ezekiel. Let's start working on it together. And so it's a lot stronger because it has all of those different thoughts and all the different brains kind of working on it together and determining how they're going to translate it. So that's the main reason why I prefer that.
Oh, it's good to know. I have always read the NIV, so
what I really like, I've got this whole wall here. We probably have about 20 Bibles in different translations, but very rarely do I pull any of them off the shelf because what I love to do is go on BibleGateway.com and you can pull up different translations of the Bible. And I like to compare the different ones. So I when I'm just reading generally, I use the NRSV, but sometimes the Contemporary English Bible is good. The Contemporary English Version is written at a 4th grade level. So when I'm reading to children, I often use that one. It's just the language is a little easier and the grammar is a little easier. And people who are learning English and learning how to read, it's easier for them to read it. So they're, just different translations have their own value. And then of course you've got some of the paraphrase versions like The Voice or The Message that sometimes, they don't translate literally word for word what the Hebrew says, but they translate the kind of theme, the idea of what is being said. And sometimes those translations can be really powerful to encourage you to think differently about a passage that you're reading. So I like to jump from different.
You including the Peterson Bible?
What's that?
What?
What was that,
Are
Pam?
you including the Peterson Bible in your various Bibles?
The
The
message,
Peterson
yeah.
Message?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I also like to read different versions, and English being my second language, sometimes I like to compare the Portuguese versions and the English versions to get a better meaning for myself.
Yeah.
So I totally agree with you. I use the Bible online. I don't use my paper Bible anymore. That's an NIV version. I use my Bible app online, and I can read different versions and compare and get a
Right,
better meaning.
Right. Yeah, to me, I think the most important thing is to remember that every Bible translation is a translation, it's an interpretation. And so if you stick with the same one all the time, I think that kind of gets stuck in your head as this is the Bible, this is what it is. But I think it's helpful to remind ourselves that the very act of translating is an interpretation. And so it's important that we, even if we don't have access to the original, and really we don't, because even the Old Testament itself is not the very original. Nobody has access to the very first manuscript of any of these books. Obviously, they're lost to us through time and disintegration and things like that. And so all of it is a translation. All of it is an interpretation of the words that God inspired these people to write down. So I think it's helpful to when you're jumping from translation to translation, to keep that in mind and understand that what we're looking for isn't the word itself. What we're looking for is the meaning behind the word. We're looking for the word of God within the words, rather than looking at the words themselves as the word of God. And I think that is an important distinction to keep in mind. And I don't know, I'm a word person too. I was an English major, so I like to compare different words and, if it's this word, what could that mean? And if it's this word, what could that mean? So sorry, small little tangent there.
I have a question.
Yeah.
On chapter 12, verse 4, I can't remember what the word that your translation had. Mine said knowledge. So many will go back and forth and knowledge will increase, but yours said something different and it jumped out at me.
Mine said evil.
Evil.
Yep.
Evil.
Yep.
So I don't think of knowledge as being evil, but how it confused me.
So that's another interesting thing in terms of how translations work. So when you're looking at the Old Testament, the first thing that you have to know is Hebrew is a language that technically does not have any vowels. So let me see if I can show you a little bit of this. All right, can you see the Hebrew characters here?
Everything is upside down on mine.
No, it isn't.
Maybe
Not that it would matter, but
can you, if you turn the iPad around, I don't know, that might help. So
Now it's upside down.
So these are, this is just the title page of the Bible, but it says Torah, Ketuvim, Nevi'im, Ketuvim. And those are the three different parts of the Bible, but that's not the point. So you can see that there are these different shapes, and those are the letters of the consonants. But if I go back here, I can also pull up. So here is what it looks like when you add in vowels. So see all these little dots?
Yes.
Have you ever heard, did they ever talk about dots and tittles to you in school? Maybe referring to the dotting your I's and crossing your T's. Dots, these are called dots and tittles. And they are the vowels in Hebrew. And so
Dots and dashes.
yeah, all the little dots and things at the bottom and the top, those are all the vowels. So the original Hebrew didn't look like this. The original Hebrew looked like the other one with no vowels. And the other thing is, there was no paper. They didn't have paper. They used, animal skins in the earliest times, and then they used papyrus after that. But it was very, very expensive to make. And so if you wanted to save space, you wouldn't put spaces in between your words, because that took up extra space that you didn't have. And so even this is not what it originally would have looked like. It would have just been a line with no spaces in between the words of all the letters. And so it's basically like, let me see if I could pull up. Okay. So it would be basically like if in English I typed, if I typed this. So that doesn't mean anything to you, right?
Correct.
If I were to go in as a scholar of this English language, I could figure out that it says this. But when I go to try to put in my spaces, where do I put my spaces?
Oh,
So this is what they had to do with the Hebrew Bible to figure out how to translate it. First, you have to be able to read it so that you can then translate it. And so sometimes you get these words that they can't figure out if it means now, here, or nowhere, if it means evil or knowledge. And
Katie, can I read my translation? Because it seems like it's different.
Sure.
Okay, so 12:4. This is a confidential report, Daniel, for your eyes and ears only. Keep it secret. Put the book under lock and key until the end. In the interim, there is going to be a lot of frantic running around trying to figure out what's going on. That seems different to me.
Yeah.
seems closer to knowledge.
Closer to knowledge than evil, for sure. Yeah. So that, I think, is what's going on when we've got a completely different word and doesn't even have a similarity in terms of the meaning. I think it's this. It's this.
I think that makes a lot of sense.
How do we do this?
That makes a lot of sense. Yeah.
It does.
All right.
Thank you, Katie.
You're welcome.
Yes.
That's good.
We're in trouble. We don't know if God's now here or nowhere.
Right.
And we won't find out till the end.
That's right.
Oh, Beth, that was a good one.
Okay. So let me run you through just quickly some of what's happening in these chapters, because I didn't do a historical context video or PowerPoint presentation that covers a lot of this stuff. This is the only place that these things appear. And so the difference between this chapter and the previous chapters that we've already talked about is that I think at this point, the author of chapter 11 is not just attempting to place his own context, his own situation, his own experiences into this theological framework. He is trying to understand basically the entire sweep of history. And so when you've got, we've already got he had in his hand a Bible very similar to what we have in the Old Testament at this point. And so history before the Babylonian exile was pretty much solid. It was taken care of. We understood what was going on with that and what God was doing. But when you get into some of the later events around the Babylonian exile, like I told you last week, or maybe the week before, the book of Jeremiah was not finalized until this much later period during the kind of 150s BC. The book of Daniel was not finalized until the 150s. And so they have these stories of these later books, but they're not finalized yet. And so I think what this author is trying to do is, starting from that history, that they understand, which is the period before the exile. Now we're trying to understand how God is acting in the exile, and he's kind of trying to take all of the events that occur from when the exile ends up through his contemporary time, his now, and figure out how they all fit together in terms of this message that we're trying to elicit from the meaning of these events, to understand who God is and what God is up to. So we start not with what we typically see, but and kind of jump. Usually we jump very quickly from the Persians into the Greeks, and then we kind of skip right over Alexander the Great, and then we've got the division of the four parts of Alexander's empire among his generals. Those things are all still here. So you see that in kind of verses 2 through 4. While he's still rising to power, his kingdom shall be broken and divided toward the four winds of heaven. So we've seen that before, that Alexander took over basically the entire known world, and then at the prime of his life, he died, leaving no heirs. And so his generals, 4 of his generals, fought until they decided that they were going to just divide the empire into 4 pieces so that each of them could have their own area and they could kind of leave each other alone, which they did not do. They continued to fight with each other anyway. But that's that reference. But then we get a lot more interest in and description of things that happened after that. And this is the only place in Daniel that we get a lot of those descriptions. So we get, let me look here and see. So starting with like verse 5, we get some other history that isn't mentioned anywhere else in the book of Daniel. The king that the general that took over the south, which was mostly kind of Egypt area, was called Ptolemy, and so that's why that's called the Ptolemaic dynasty, the Ptolemaic Empire. And he was in charge of Egypt, and then one of his officers, Seleucus, was assigned to be in charge of Babylon. And so the Seleucid Empire, as it came to be known, was where Babylon is now, or was then before that. And so it was there was actually a division between the two, that they were supposed to kind of be one kingdom, and Seleucus was supposed to be on board with Ptolemy and helping him and supporting him so that they could have this whole empire together. But instead, a terrible rift happened. Around 250 BCE, Seleucus's grandson, Antiochus II, married the daughter of Ptolemy II. So they were trying to officially put these two groups together and make it one big empire covering all of Babylon all the way down through Egypt. But she died in childbirth because somebody actually like murdered her. And that the person that murdered her was the mother of her husband, her mother-in-law. And so there's all this political intrigue and attempts to undermine the putting together of this group of people who wanted to, make this a strong, united, full empire. There were people who didn't want that to happen. So that's kind of what's going on in verses 5 through 7. She shall not retain her power, and her offspring shall not endure. She shall be given up, she and her attendants and her child and the one who supported her. So that's what's being described there. Then we get into, there's some other intrigue with, infighting between later generations of Ptolemies and Seleucuses that are also described here. I don't think it's important that we get all the details of this. If you're interested in it, I can send you all this stuff with the names and the dates and the places and all that kind of thing. But I don't think that's the point. I think the point is that we can look at this and we can see all of these historical events being described. but they aren't being described as, you know, this person did this and this person did this and this person did this. It's using that apocalyptic feel, that apocalyptic literature kind of language to express this history. So instead of it being, you know, this is what this queen is doing and this is what this king is doing, it's using these more generic terminologies to make it into an apocalypse. And apocalyptic literature was very popular at this time in the 150s, 160s BCE. And so it would be kind of like, are you familiar with fan fiction today, when people take characters from a common and popular book series and kind of write their own stories using the same thing? There was a lot of apocalyptic fan fiction going on at this time, that people would take images from known apocalypses and modify them to fit their own feelings, their own message that they were trying to convey. And that's kind of what's happening here, that this person is taking this form of literature, apocalypticism, and inserting the history of the Jewish people into it so that it can be expressed in this way that it seems mysterious and kind of not entirely known, but also describing very specific things. And you know, this one's actually better than some of the other ones because it doesn't bring in monsters and beasts and horns and all those types of things, but it is attempting to veil it a little bit. And at the same time, you know, we talked about with the chapters about the beasts and the monsters, that they also couldn't be completely explicit in the way that they described things because they were criticizing the people who were in charge. And so if they were explicit about who they were talking about and how they were interpreting these things, then they could get themselves into some pretty serious trouble if they went too far with it. So if you have any questions, you know, specifically about any of the events that are described here in some of these verses, especially the earlier ones, like I said, I'd be happy to send you all of the details, but it just kind of goes on and on and on with this person and this person and this person. And it's not really, I don't think, necessary to understand exactly what it's describing, but just to know that it is describing specific events in the history between the Persian Empire and the time of Antiochus IV. And that's where the important stuff starts happening. So we get to verse 20. Then shall arise in his place one who shall send an official for the glory of the kingdom, but within a few days he shall be broken, though not in anger or in battle. That is the reference to Seleucus IV, who we've already talked about was the official king of the Seleucid Empire, but then his brother, Antiochus IV, suddenly and mysteriously becomes the king after Seleucus IV dies. And even though he has sons, he has heirs, those sons do not become the king. His brother Antiochus becomes the king. So what's going on with that? Why is that? He didn't die because of anger or in battle. He died because he was murdered. And in his place shall arise a contemptible person on whom royal majesty had not been conferred. So he, you know, this is Antiochus IV. He did not inherit the throne; he took it for himself. And now this is where we're describing the events that are really important to the person who is speaking. So, you know, it kind of, you can even see as the section goes through, the amount of time spent on each section of history increases. So there are only 3 verses about all of the history from the Persian Empire all the way through the establishment of the 4 kingdoms in Alexander's Greek Empire. That covers about 250 years, and they talk about it for only 3 verses. Then they spend, you know, a little bit more time. They spend from verse 5 through verse 19 talking about the next section of years. That's about 200 years. But then they get to verse 21, and the whole rest of the chapter is all about that one person and just those few years. And so clearly this is what they're trying to get at here. all of these different things that we've kind of already seen before, that Antiochus the Fourth was a nasty guy. He allowed a lot of terrible things to happen to the Jewish people because of even some disagreement among the Jews about how they ought to interact with their new overlords. So some Jews said, well, the Greeks are here, they're not going anywhere, they have all the power, so we should probably just accept them, we should try to accommodate them, we should learn their language, we should allow some of their culture in and just accept that this is how it's going to be now. But some other people said, no, we have to maintain our purity. We have to be God's people and be the people that we have been called to be in all ways, not just in terms of our religious practices, but also in terms of our cultural practices and, maintaining clean distance from Gentiles and all this kind of stuff. So this book of Daniel was written by that second group, by people who believed that they needed to stay pure and not to participate in any of this stuff. And you can see that in places like, let's see, let me find one. 32. He shall seduce with intrigue those who violate the covenant, but the people who are loyal to their God shall stand firm and take action. The wise among the people shall give understanding to many. For some days, however, they shall fall by sword and flame and suffer captivity and plunder. So that's talking about the people who are seduced, the ones who decide that they aren't going to follow God's law as strictly anymore, or maybe even at all. They are called the Hellenizing Jews, the ones who decide to become Greek. But they are criticized by this writer. This writer believes that in order to maintain your Jewish identity, you have to be completely loyal to God. And even though you are being persecuted, even though it seems like there's absolutely no hope for any change because the Greeks have complete power over you, they are, they're going to stand firm and hold on to their God and accept the persecution that is going to come because of that. And so that, I think, is where, where we're starting to get this judgment of history stuff. Why is this happening? We don't know why, but we do know that we are on the right side. It might not seem like we're on the right side because we're the ones who are getting plundered. We're the ones who are getting killed. We're the ones who are getting hurt. We're the ones who are getting beaten. But what we do know is that the story is not over yet, that God is still here. God is still in control, and we are doing the right thing. And so this is very, very much meant to be a support for, an encouragement to other people who feel the same way, that they need to stay true to their faith. They need to stay true to who they know God wants them to be, even through all the persecution that they're experiencing, even through all the hardship, and that they are doing the right thing that God wants them to be doing. And so it's looking around, at this point, it's not looking back so much like it is earlier in the chapter, but it's looking around. What's happening right now? What are some of the events that have occurred in recent days that are just very confusing to us? Because if we are right, if the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob does want us to remain pure Jews, then why are we getting beaten up like this? Why are these things happening in the way that they're happening? And those are the questions that this author is attempting to answer. So then we get to down here to verse, let's see, verse like 40. Yeah, so verses 36 through 39 are describing the circumstances that these people are living in at this time. So the king acts as he pleases. He exalts himself. He's better than any god. He doesn't care about our God, certainly, because he thinks that he is the God. He's in charge. He's prospering. Everything is going his way. Why? If God is against this guy, if this is not how it should be, then why is this guy doing so well for himself? Well, now we're going to get the answer to that. And so then we get to verse 40. And verse 40 is the exact moment when we can figure out when this person is writing. So, like I've said before, this went on with Antiochus for 3 years. He invaded Jerusalem and decided, well, he didn't invade because he already owned it, but he came to Jerusalem and he was really angry about this battle that he had lost against Egypt in 167. The reason that he lost that battle was because the Romans came in and helped the Egyptians to defeat him. And so that reference to Kittim in verse 30, that's a description of that incident. So he's mad, he's on his way home, defeated, embarrassed by what has happened to him. And so he gets really upset and he decides that he's going to take it out on the Jews, and he desolates their temple. He forbids them to practice their religion, no more sacrifices, and he slaughters a pig on the altar of the Lord in the temple. And so the altar is desecrated. It can no longer be used. It is unclean. It's impure for its use. Plus, he tells them that they're not allowed to do sacrifices anymore anyhow. Plus, he also establishes a new high priest who is not the real high priest. He's not a legitimate high priest because he has been put in place by a foreign power rather than by the laws of God. And so everything is all in shambles. And why? Why is this happening to us? How is it that this guy is continuing to succeed in the face of all this horrible stuff that he's doing? So in 167 is when he profanes the temple and makes all these new laws. In 164, the Maccabees, the Judas Maccabeus comes in, and they finally gain their religious freedom back. And so we know that this person was writing between 167 and 165, 164. And the reason we know that is because we've had all of these incredible details that are describing line by line, item by item, all of these things that have happened. And then all of a sudden, it gets a lot more vague and it has incorrect information in it. So when we look at verse 40, it just kind of has some generic stuff. At that time, the king of the south shall attack him, but the king of the north shall rush upon him like a whirlwind, and when he'll come to the beautiful land, tens of thousands shall fall victim, but parts of it will escape. He'll stretch his hand against the countries, and the land of Egypt shall not escape. He'll take over Egypt, and he'll completely destroy them. But then he will pitch his tent between the sea and the beautiful holy mountain. So he'll be in Israel, and he shall come to his end with no one to help him. So the prediction here is that Antiochus is going to get into this huge battle with Egypt. He will win the battle against Egypt. He will take over Egypt. But because he needs to return home to deal with some reports from the east and the north, he will be on his way home. He'll pitch his tents in Israel, and he will die in Israel. And that is not actually what happened. In 165, Antiochus was campaigning in Persia, which was to the west, and that's where he died. He died in Persia in battle. And I don't bring this up to, say, oh, well, look, this person wasn't right in their prophecy, but to show you that, it doesn't have to be that these things are describing something that's going to happen in the future. So the way that the book is set up, the kind of within the context of the story itself, this story is being told to Daniel. And Daniel, of course, lived all the way back in, this was happening in like 538 or something like that. So the idea is that you take the historical events that are happening around you and you place them in the setting of someone who can't possibly know these things, so that it becomes a prophecy in the sense of, how we typically understand prophecy, foretelling the future, what's going to happen, what is going to happen, that question that people want to know. But what's actually happening is the person who's writing this isn't Daniel. The person who's writing this is somebody who's living during this time of confusion and chaos and persecution. And they're asking, why is this happening? And they are couching their own history in terms of what God is doing and in terms of how the people around them, the powers around them, are in opposition to God, so that they can understand better why this is happening. Why is this happening? Okay, so what questions do you have about that before we get into chapter 12?
And there was all sorts of intrigue going on with like in-laws killing in-laws and people taking over kingdom reigns over other kings that were kids.
Yes. Yes. And I think that, that kind of, it makes sense. Well, if all of this crazy stuff is happening around us, how can God be in control? Where do we find God in this situation? In some ways we see that happening to us now. We look around and we see the chaos swirling around us. We see the coronavirus out of control in certain parts of the world at different times. We see the political stuff that's going on in America right now. And it's natural to ask, where's God? Why is all this stuff happening? And then the next question you ask after that is, when is it going to stop? What's going to happen next? I want to know, how this is going to play out, because I'm afraid. I feel uncertainty. I feel fear. I feel, I feel out of control of this situation. And so we start asking that question, what is going to happen? But what we need to ask is the question, why is this happening? To understand what God is doing and how God is acting and how God is responding to the events in our world, which is not the human nature question to ask, but I think it's the faithful question to ask.
There's no answer to the why, is there?
No.
And so throughout history, there's been no answer to the why until you go back and study it. So, 25, 30 years from now, will they study this and understand why?
Possibly,
I don't
or at least they'll maybe have some theories. I mean, we can't, we talked the one day about the violence of God and the violence in the Old Testament. And I ordered a book about it. So possibly we could do another one of these studies on violence in the Bible. And I think that would be a really cool one to do. But anyway, I'm getting ahead of myself on topics. But we talked that one day about violence and, is it God's will that people be punished? Is it is it appropriate to interpret events happening in our world as God's punishment upon those people? And we kind of talked about, well, the Bible contains God's word, but it is also written by humans. And so is it correct when we say, well, the why is that God is punishing us because we did something bad? Or is that telling us more about the people who are making that interpretation than it does about the God that they're trying to interpret? And so certainly over time, we come up with theories about why something is happening based on what happens next. We could, maybe in 30 years, we'll have a much better, understanding of other cultures, and we'll be more interconnected than ever because of how we were all stuck at home. And, we'll be able to everybody will assume that you can get on a call and talk to people in China and talk to people in France and all these different things. And that will just be part of the regular culture. And so then people might say, oh, well, the coronavirus really helped us to come to this place. And so maybe God gave us the coronavirus so that we could learn these things and come to this place. And, I'm very uncomfortable with that idea, because does God really want hundreds of thousands of people to die so that we can learn a lesson or so that we can come up with new technologies? I don't know that I'm on board with that, but that's something that somebody might say. And certainly the why is a compelling question, But I think you're right. I think we have to move beyond the why into the main point, which is not when is this going to happen, not what is going to happen, not even why is this happening, but to the reminder that the point is that no matter what is happening, God is in control. God's will shall be done. If God's will has not yet been done, then it's not the end of the story.
You know, for many, I'm sorry, Louisa, did you want to say something?
No, go ahead.
I
Go
taught drug abuse prevention in the schools and at Simpson College. And one of the things that I used to say was that the drug abuse of the 60s, when there was such rampant drug use, that the good that came out of that was that people started studying addiction in the brain and how that occurred. And because of that, they came up with all kinds of treatments for people with mental illnesses and issues like that. And so I always tend to look at, well, what is the lesson? What are we going to gain from this? Not why did it happen, but was it the way for us to get the tools to work with people who were so severely mentally ill? I don't know.
Yeah, I think there's definitely a subtle difference between why is this happening so that we can get this lesson. God gave us this, God punished us in this way, or God, sent this horrible thing so that we could get to this place. There's a difference between that and this awful thing has happened. We don't know why. We don't know where it came from. We don't know if it's because there is a literal devil in the world that brings evil upon us and that God is trying to battle it, or if it's because of the sin that is part of the brokenness of our world because of Adam and Eve, or if it is something else entirely. We don't know why. But what we do know is that God gives us grace and hope in those situations to bring something positive out of it. That it's not caused for the purpose of bringing something positive out of it, but that light can come out of darkness because of God's grace and God's love. That God provides for that possibility, even in the face of deep hopelessness. And I think that there's a subtle difference between those two things, but I think is an important distinction to make. Anything else up to that point? All right, well then let's take a look at chapter 12, which is just a continuation of chapter 11, but it's divided out, I think, into its own chapter because it kind of serves as an epilogue to this long description of the history and to the specific events that are described, and they're trying to interpret it there. We get to verse 40, and like I said, that is where the speculation comes in and the description of past history ends. But I don't think it necessarily matters so much that the exact events that would occur and would bring an end to Antiochus IV are correct. Because the point is not, like I said, not to describe history, not to write down history as it occurred, or to, if you're looking at it from the perspective of the character Daniel, to hear about how things are going to unfold. The point is above that. The point is beyond that. And then, I think chapter 12 is where we get to that bigger point. We transition from the earthly description, from the description of what is happening on earth and how it is influencing the people of God and God himself. And now we get to the heavenly realm. We transition into how this is playing out on that other plane. And like we talked about last week with the spiritual warfare stuff, we've got this secondary plane of existence with angels and princes and this kind of thing going on. And so it says, Michael will arise, and there'll be anguish and all these things, and people who were sleeping shall awaken, and the wise shall shine like the brightness of the sky. This is a pretty standard judgment scene from apocalyptic literature, and it often was used in apocalyptic literature to provide that conclusion, to kind of round off what was being said in the historical part of the apocalyptic writing, or the description of the beasts and who they represent and all those types of things. So we are making sure that as we're reading this stuff, people don't forget that this isn't just a description of history. This is a description of history, an interpretation of history for the purpose of understanding what God is doing in the world and what's going on here, and to bring that hope to the people. So it's not just that in verse 45, Antiochus will finally die and will be freed of him. That doesn't really bring that much hope. I mean, sure, that particular individual is no longer oppressing us, but after him will probably be somebody else, and that person might be even worse than him. And so we'll miss him because at least he didn't do X to us, or at least he didn't do Y to us. That doesn't bring the kind of hope that we're looking for. And so we bring it up to this, we kind of bring it up a notch. We bring it up to the heavenly realm, and we say, no, the point here is not that eventually Antiochus will die and we'll be able to continue to go along as we've been going on, and not know what's going to happen next, not know what kind of person we're going to have pressing us next, or helping us out a little bit next. The point of this is that there is going to be an end. There is going to be a conclusion to all of this that is not going to look like this anymore. And I think, as we get even further into chapter 12, we see that a little bit more explicitly. We have Daniel looking on the riverbank. We remember all the way back to chapter 10 where he was when he had this vision, and he sees these two guys, and they're talking to each other. How long shall it be until the end of these wonders? And he says, it would be for a time, 2 times, and half a time, which is something that we've already seen before. And we talked about how it's 1 time plus 2 times plus half a time is 3.5. 3.5 is half of 7. 7 is the number of completion. And so again, the amount of time that it's describing isn't important. What's important is it's not the end. We're only halfway through. We don't know what the next half is going to look like, but we do know what the end is going to look like. The end is going to look like the wise shall shine like the brightness of the sky. The end shall look like people shall be delivered. The end is going to look like God's kingdom. And again, I'll remind you that this isn't, in this period, they haven't developed yet a robust theology of heaven. So this isn't the end of time. The time of the end is not the end of the world. The time of the end is the end of this oppression. The time of the end is when God is finally going to reestablish the way that God wants things to be on earth, and everything will be according to God's will for all of the earth. And so this is an earthly time of the end, an earthly change that will occur. But even these heavenly beings are asking, how long, when? And the answer is, I don't know, but it's not the end yet. It will come. And there are two other places where it kind of mentions that there are 2 different sets of time of days that are listed in verses 11 and 12. From the time that the regular burnt offering is taken away and the abomination that desolates is set up, there shall be 1,290 days, and happy are those who persevere and attain the 1,335 days. Those are both approximately 3.5 years worth of days. Some scholars think that these are descriptions that use 2 different calendars. The lunar calendar is approximately 1,290 days, and the solar calendar is approximately 1,335 days to make 3.5 years. But again, the point isn't to get exact days and times and numbers of years and all these kinds of things. And that's just there to remind us that it's not the end yet. We're still in the middle of this, and we know what the end is going to look like. And so we can have hope in that. We can rely on God. We know that God is in control. We know that God's will is going to be done.
Hmm.
And at the end of the story, Daniel says, you're going to go on and you're going to die, and then you'll get your inheritance.
Yes.
So did you guys go through Daniel 12? I had to take a break because I got a phone call from my doctor that I couldn't.
Oh yeah,
Not take-
sorry, we just talked a little bit about, that we're taking it up a notch. We're moving beyond just the historical earthly events, and making sure that we are aware that this is a cosmic question. This isn't just talking about and interpreting what's happening on earth, but we're being reminded that God is involved in this, that this impacts heaven, this impacts eternity. And that the three, there are several references to that 3.5, again, the time and a half, time 2 times and 1.5 a time, and then certain numbers of days that represent 3.5 years. And so this is, again, just a reminder that we haven't reached the end yet. We don't know when the time will come, but if God's will has not been done, then we have not reached the end. So it brings that hope back around.
Katie, can I ask a question? It feels less than stellar, but when they're figuring out what these days mean, it's basically the people that are just such good scholars that they understand the different kinds of calendars, and maybe incorporating more people into the story somehow, and just figuring out the general meaning of that it's not as significant as some people might think. I mean, it's just their general knowledge and capacity for understanding where they come to that.
You're asking how do people?
I mean, how does a regular person reading this go? Yeah, I mean, just a regular person reading that. How do we know this?
So I think the first point is that as a regular person you don't, because this was written in a particular context, and so the person that was writing this was writing it to certain people. He was writing it to his colleagues who wanted to remain true to their faith as Jews, to not become Hellenized, to not fall into the trap of allowing Antiochus to guide the way that they live their lives and the way that they practice their religion. And so what he's doing is he's making reference to all kinds of historical events that those people would have recognized. But because this is an ancient text, we today don't understand those ins and outs. And if you're interested in it from that perspective, we can go back and we can look at historical records, and there are people who are scholars, who are experts on this time period, who could read this and know exactly what it's talking about, because they know all the names of these people and what year this happened and what year that happened and all that kind of thing. But I think I think that is more of a scholarly activity, because if this is in our Bible, God isn't saying to us that this particular event that happened in the year 253 in December is important for us in our faith. I don't think that that's the message. I think the message is that the way that we as humans interact with suffering, the way that we respond to persecution and to chaos and to situations that give us fear and dread and hopelessness is always the same. That, whether you are a person who has just lost their home in Jerusalem because it burned down, and then you're taken into captivity in Babylon and it's the year 587 BC, whether you are a Jew living in Jerusalem at the time of Antiochus and your faith has been banned and you don't know how to handle that because you know that if you practice your religion and somebody catches you, you will die, whether you are a Christian living in Rome during the time of Nero, and you know that if you are caught, you're going to be burned or thrown to the lions, or whether you are, you know, a Mennonite during the Radical Reformation, and they know that, you know, that if you get caught, you're going to be murdered and hung up on a, you know, hung up in a cage over the church, or whether it's today and you feel that, you know, you need to act in a particular way in response to the political and social situation that you see in your life. All of those situations, we can't possibly understand the specific events that cause someone to act in a particular way because we're not in their context. We didn't see the events happening in the way that they saw them. But what we do know is that the one thing that all of those things have in common is that it's all about God. We are supposed to be faithful. We're supposed to watch. We're supposed to be patient. And we are supposed to know that God will deliver us in God's time. And I think that is the message that we can cull from this. But again, that isn't a message that you can get just from reading it, you know, on its face. That's a message that you have to get by looking through the words to find the word of God within the words of the text. And that's a lot harder. That's a lot more work than just reading it literally. But to me, that's a lot more powerful message than what you could get just by reading it on its face.
Thanks.
What else?
When Karen was asking about verse 4 on Daniel 12, and there was that question that you explained with the Hebrew about evil or knowledge or whatever, that made me think of the tree of good and evil, you know, that sometimes, is there a correlation, or it's something that we can kind of think about, that, you know, if you're looking for too much knowledge, or, you know, you're supposed to just trust God and look at the bigger picture, you know, at keep your faith and look at the bigger picture, his promises. We have been seeing that. Pat will attest to it in our Joseph study on Wednesdays, instead of focusing on what is going on now and asking why and when, we should, like you're saying, keep our faith in God, knowing that he is always doing everything for our good at the end, and look at the bigger picture at the end, which is the promise of eternal life. And there's wanting to know too much, and that's why Daniel was instructed to keep that a secret. Could it be the equivalent to the tree of good and evil?
Boy, that sure helps explain the difference between the two translations to me.
That's interesting. Yeah, I'm just, I'm looking at so like, remember what I said about how it's only the consonants. So I'm looking at the consonants for the word evil and the consonants for the word knowledge, and they do look very similar. If you want to, I can show you. Can everybody see?
Looks like a one.
Okay.
So here I typed in knowledge, and here is the three Hebrew characters for knowledge. This is yada is basically how you would say that. And then if I type in evil, you can see there's a little bit of a switch there. This one looks very similar to the one that was in the middle before. That one had a straight line sticking out, and this is kind of a curved one. But if you compare them back and forth, you can see, you know, that middle one looks very similar to the other one. That's the first one, and it's almost like those two are switched. So, you know, in terms of looking at a manuscript that is very old, that, you know, might have some holes in it or have some scribbles or mismarkings or worn off spaces, you could definitely see how those two words could get mixed up.
But isn't it the basics that God doesn't really want us to, or it's not our role as Christians or believers that we want to know all the answers, but that we trust Him for His promises and believe that He's always going to,
Yes.
be faithful, because He is, and He's always going to do the best
Yes.
for us, no matter what we go through during our journey in this world. But eventually it's for us to focus on the bigger picture of God out there at the end of the run.
Right.
And the other thing I was thinking when I was reading Daniel 12, is it appropriate to say that maybe this Daniel 12 would be the revelation, the equivalent to revelation to the Jews, as opposed to Revelation being the revelation for us, for the Gentiles, or for whoever came after that?
Yeah, so apocalyptic literature, those are definitely both examples of apocalypse. And certainly Revelation, the book that is in our New Testament, takes a lot of its imagery from Daniel. So you can see a lot of this repeated again in that book. Lutherans tend to be afraid of the book of Revelation because it's so weird, and if Rich thinks this is bad, he should try some Revelation sometime, because the whole thing is like this, the second half of Daniel.
Yeah.
And I think that one has in the 20s in terms of chapters of this. But it has the same goal. The purpose is the same. The purpose is to interpret what is happening around us, to express what is happening to us in a way that frames it within God's story, so that we can understand at least a little bit how this fits into who God is and what God is doing in the world, and so that we can participate in that in the most faithful way that we possibly can, so that we can have hope in the future, so that we can know what the ending is going to look like, and so that we then, in the capacities that we have, can participate in helping things to move along in that direction, not because God needs us to, but because God calls us to do that, because God asks us to be partners in that. And I think that is a powerful source of hope in itself, to know that, sure, God could, come right now and say, no more of this. This is craziness. We're not going to do this anymore. But instead, God allows us the space to be God's people, and allows us the grace to mess up and to do the wrong thing sometimes, and to reverse course, and to continue to learn and grow as people of faith together. And I think that that's part of God's grace, and that's part of the hope that God gives us.
Great. Very interesting. Very eye-opening.
Well, I think that we are.
And the situation with Rich is not that he's fearful or anything. It's just that, he's at a phase in his life, with his cancer and everything, that he wants to stick with what brings hope, and not that this doesn't bring hope, but that brings peace and positive things. He doesn't want to be storming his brain anymore, and I can totally understand that about him. His faith is strong, and and he wants to just keep it that way.
Yeah, that's totally fine. I totally understand that. This is not for everyone, for sure, in terms of digging into all of this and kind of dwelling within it. All right, any other final thoughts on the book of Daniel? I think that, this will certainly give us some new ways of understanding. And when the very rare occasions come around when this is read in worship, you'll have a little bit of a better grasp on what's happening. I don't think any of the later weirdo stuff is ever read in worship, but some of the earlier stories pop up every once in a while. And then, of course, when you're doing your own reading, you can probably see some of these same themes popping up in other places and in your Bible reading and in your life. And I hope it has helped you with some of your own wrestling with what you're going to do, because I think the point here is that we always have the same inclinations as humans to ask that question, what's going to happen, why, and all of that. But we need to stop. We need to say, why is this happening? We need to try to frame the events of our lives and the events of our world in the framework of God's kingdom, so that we can understand it from God's perspective, and so that we can respond faithfully to it, and to have that hope and provide that hope to other people around us in the face of various disasters that we are experiencing now and will experience in the future.
Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you all so much. This has been awesome and fun and enlightening, and I'm really glad we did it. And I look forward to seeing some of you again in 2 weeks for our next thing. Bill, I know you and Marge have lots of summer things going on and won't be able to join us, but hopefully you'll be able to hop back in at some point if we continue to do this whole Zoom thing going forward.
Yeah,
in the fall.
we'll keep it in mind and see how things go.
Yep, we'll make sure everybody knows about what's happening.
Okay.
All right.
Good.
Thank you all so
Okay.
much for your loyalty and your
you.
investment in this. And I hope that you got something out of it. Have a wonderful couple of weeks, and I'll see some of you again soon.
Okay,
Thank
thank
you.
you,
Thank you.
Katie.
Thanks,
It's been very
everybody.
good. Thank
Bye-bye.
you. Thank you.
Bye, guys.
Bye.